In Kiyoshi Kurosawa's 2001 Japanese horror movie Kairo, or Pulse if you want to go by its English name, but I'm going to call it Cairo in this video just to differentiate it from its American remake, the internet is a ghost world. A lonely, sad plane filled with the wandering husks of what used to be humanity. Sad spirits become trapped in its endless void, desperate for a social connection, but unable to make them with the others that occupy this abstract reality, all of which who are equally doomed to the cursed experience of eternal isolation, until, with nowhere else to go, these phantoms must abandon that existence and wander into a reality they're too broken to truly exist within. That's right, this film predicted Elon Musk's Twitter takeover. J-horror is not a genre. The Japanese output in horror cinema is just as varied as any other country's. A full, diverse world of unique subgenres and interesting original narratives. Yet when I say the word J-horror, there's probably a specific image that comes to mind, namely the ghostly pale dark-haired kids of the likes of the Ju-on and the Ring series. It's pretty easy to see why though. To the layman, J-horror has kind of become a shorthand synonymous term to describe these sorts of supernatural depictions of angry, vengeful ghosts with a complexion not too dissimilar to my own. Hideo Nakata's Ringu, the film that brought these visuals to a global audience in the late 90s, proved to be one of the most influential horror films for the early 2000s and beyond, with not just an Asian audience but a Western one too. In Japan, the aesthetic style of its creepy TV escaper and curse-based subject matter, alongside the similarly themed Ju-on series, whose first short films Katsumi and Ten Foes debuted in the same year as Ringu, cemented some of the visual designs, tropes and atmosphere that would inform countless movies that came after them, including the likes of Takashi Miike's 2003 film One Missed Call, Nakata's own evolution with his 2002 effort Dark Water, as well as the franchises and remakes literally every one of those films spawned. Ringu and Ju-on in particular being so huge that even their remakes got their own franchises. Despite the fact that Japanese horror movies have existed since the 60s, these multi-film franchises and their remakes all sort of popping up together in a brief few years created a kind of new wave of Japanese horror. One that put this little corner of cinema on the global stage in a way it had never been before. This renaissance of renewed interest basically coined the term J-horror in the West. But because this was a lot of the world's first exposure to that kind of cinema, the visual image of a pale and occasionally gurgling child became the defining face for a whole country's cinematic output. And personally, I kind of think that's a little bit of a shame. I don't think you should define these movies by the unnaturally powdery whiteness of their antagonists' skins. If that's all it was about, you could stick a bunch of gingers in a movie and call it a J-horror. I'm a redhead, I'm allowed to say that. But yeah, even if we take just this little period of time where these kind of movies were the dominant export, if we're going to entertain the term J-horror, and we're going to define it by anything, it should be the movement away from the conventional jump scare, CG and gore combo that defined so much of what the West was doing with horror, to a far more restrained approach towards terror. One that prioritised a much more slow-building sense of dread and unease, and left a lot of the scares to the audience's imagination. And I say this because, for me, that's my biggest takeaway from these films. It's also why a lot of their American remakes don't land as well, but that's a whole other video. Even going back to Ringu, which kind of kicked off this whole style, the appeal of that film is found far more in its quiet, uneasy discomfort than it is in any shocking moment. Yeah, Sadako crawling out of the TV screen is iconic and terrifying, but it's not shocking. Well, it's a shocking development maybe, but it's not carried out in a way to elicit shock. If you watch that original ending, there's no moment where she suddenly lurches at the screen to the tune of a big violin screech. No instance of violence as payoff to her stalking. We don't get to see what she is capable of, we just know something bad is about to happen. And all of that badness is left up to our imagination. Compared to the American remake, which is actually probably the best of this batch of American remakes of Japanese horror films, they don't really execute this scene with the same deliberate slowness. They go a little bit for the shock. It's interrupted by cuts to the frantic speeding car of another character trying desperately to rush to the scene. Its music is a great deal more bombastic. There's a big trip and crash over some shelving that gives us a taste of a little bit of gore as a character crawls away through glass, and perhaps worst of all, Samara, this film's version of the creepy crawling Sadako, just straight up teleports for a jump scare. Now, I like Gorbavinsky's version of the film, but even as one of the more restrained and atmospheric Western remakes, it still massively demonstrates the different methods employed by American filmmakers and Japanese filmmakers in how they handle these stories. And this is why I think more than their iconography, this late 90s, early 2000s J-horror movement should be defined by their approach to horror, because for me, a seminal example of all of the things that made this period great and that perfectly encapsulates the specific appeal of this particular era of Japanese horror would be 2001's Cairo, which does feature ghosts, but otherwise, visually, is pretty dissimilar to all of the iconography we associate with this movement. Cairo's ghosts aren't deathly pale with jet black long hair. In fact, most of them just look kinda like normal people. The place is being haunted on old traditional Japanese houses, but rather the everyday facilities of an at the time modern Japan. Apartments, computer labs, abandoned factories. The spirits of the film aren't vengeful children with tragic backstories, but rather just sad, lonely adults. It's a totally different approach to the Japanese ghost stories that dominate this period, but one thing it has in common with progenitors like Ringu is the way it approaches horror and atmosphere with a slow building but vividly lingering dread. Cairo is a truly fascinating film. Not just because it's a great example of the kind of horror import that felt like a breath of fresh air to a Western audience that had long had their fill of teen slashers, but also because it's damn interesting in terms of what it has to say, and its themes have only become more and more relevant as time has moved on. The film follows two separate stories that eventually meet towards the third act. Michi, a young woman, moves to Tokyo and is working in a store selling plants. One of her co-workers, Taguchi, has been missing for a while, supposedly working on a disc to help the store catalogue its sales. So Michi goes to his apartment to see what's up. There, she's greeted by Taguchi, but he seems off. He's distant and aloof. And at one point when Michi turns around to pick up the disc he's been working on, when she looks back, the apartment is eerily quiet and empty. And upon investigation, she finds Taguchi's body. It seems that Taguchi has hung himself. But not only that, the body is showing signs of age, suggesting this happened a while ago, despite the fact that seemingly she was just speaking to Taguchi mere moments ago. She takes Taguchi's disc back to her co-workers Yabe and Junko, and they discover that the only thing on the disc is an image of Taguchi staring into his monitor, looking at an image of him staring into his monitor at the same image, making an infinite loop. They also discover that within another monitor in the room, there appears to be the face of an unknown presence. This kicks off a series of strange events on their end, where while investigating some of the circumstances surrounding Taguchi's death and the image on the disc, they come into some of their own ghostly encounters. Elsewhere, a student named Ryosuke has just signed up with a new internet service provider when his web browser accesses an unknown web page of its own accord, one that depicts video after video, possibly live, of people alone in dark rooms doing bizarre things, and asks him if he would like to meet a ghost. Though he immediately turns it off, his PC continues to display strange images of its own accord through the night, so he ventures to his university's computer lab to ask for help in understanding what's going on, where he meets Harue, a student interested in his described phenomena, and the two investigate the paranormal occurrences on his end of the narrative, until eventually their worlds cross paths with Michi's investigations. The plot, however, is not really what you come to Cairo for. In fact, I'd argue it's actually the movie's weakest element. I'm totally with it for the first hour or so, where it's just this fairly straightforward but mysterious vehicle with which to drive the characters into supernatural phenomena, but at some point we get a massive exposition dump where another character, one who literally only exists to somewhat explain what's going on and then is never seen from again, appears to tell Ryosuke his theory that the other side of reality has gotten too full, and so ghosts are beginning to invade the physical world and using the internet as a kind of conduit through which to return. Which to me, kind of both over-explains things and sort of doesn't explain anything at all, as there's still a bunch of stuff in that second hour it's genuinely hard to follow. I get the general gist of things enough to understand it, but it does delve into some pretty convoluted stuff to the point I'm not entirely sure I wholly get everything that is going on. Characters are suddenly turning to ash with fairly poorly aged CG. There's this whole thing with people putting bags on their heads and then shooting themselves. I'm not sure I fully understand the whole thing about red tape marking these forbidden rooms. I'm all for a bit of mystery in my horror. I don't think everything needs to be answered and can in fact be more compelling at times when it isn't. But with this, I think there's a little too much mystery. I could do with having a bit more of a clue of what's going on. And then before you know it, there's like military planes exploding and stuff. It all gets real confusing, to be honest with you all. So why do a whole video on this? What's the reason to speak so highly of it? Well, the plot might be a bit confusing in its second half, but Cairo does some really remarkable stuff that the horror scene is only just starting to catch up on now, and it did it in 2001. The plot might get weak, but the themes and the way the film explores them are anything but. With the turn of the new millennium, the world, and especially Japan, was quickly moving more and more towards a technological revolution. Commercial internet first became available in 1995, but by 2000, we were starting to leave the world of the early adopter, and it began to take form as the kind of everyday technology that everybody and their gran was using. And with that came concerns that are still valid to this day. Horror is a great genre within which to explore cultural anxieties, and a huge issue in Japan, one that is arguably magnified significantly by the introduction of internet culture, is the issue of social isolation. So much so that there's even a name for the severe social withdrawal significant portions of the country's population are known to suffer from: hikikomori. It is thought that around 500,000 Japanese youths and more than 500,000 of those who are middle-aged have become hikikomori. Essentially, total social recluses, confining themselves to a single room for periods exceeding 6 months. It's a situation that had been observed since the 1970s, but was highlighted a lot more from the 90s onward. And while not specifically about the phenomena of hikikomori or featuring any hikikomori characters, it's clear that Kairo uses the narrative device of a ghost tale to further explore some of Japan's extreme anxieties around social isolation and loneliness, and how the rapid advancements of the modern world could amplify those feelings, with technology that exists to bring people together only acting as a barrier towards real-world communication. Conceptually, you'd be forgiven for thinking this movie could be seen as some finger-wagging boomer moral panic monologuing that simplifies a huge cultural problem to those pesky computers, in the same way that people today will simplify the rise of a complex mental health disorder like depression down to being entirely the fault of smartphones. After all, you do see a lot of this soft, ill-thought-out pseudo-anti-technology hand-wringing in a lot of entertainment from around that time. But Cairo is by no means like that one episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer where a literal evil demon invades cyberspace and becomes Willow's stranger danger chatroom boyfriend. Early Buffy, man. No, Cairo handles its themes a lot more maturely, subtly, and creepily, all while framing these discussions in some of the best horror filmmaking around. There isn't a point where the film handholds you through a preachy lecture on the dangers of the internet, but it does let you feel the presence of technology as a kind of omnipresent force throughout. In almost every frame of this film, there is some kind of technology on screen. There's almost always a TV in the background, or a phone screen, or a haphazard pile of discs and PlayStation games strewn around desk, especially when characters are alone. The world of Cairo is portrayed as coldly modern, its appearance at times almost feeling like a precursor to the incredibly popular internet concept of liminal spaces, a loose abstract idea of specific spaces, usually transitional like hallways or nostalgic like swimming pools, that have an eerie stillness to them. Cairo fills its runtime with this kind of imagery, from quiet computer labs pumping in nothing but the noise of a buzzy fan under clinically fluorescent light, or its nostalgic yet strangely eerie depiction of an arcade buzzing with the noise and electricity of fighters, but totally empty of any people. It's a style and aesthetic that gives the whole world an unnatural vibe, the isolation present in its themes and narrative often feeling reflected on screen, even in scenes full of people. There's a lot of ways in which Cairo feels super influential to the kind of modern horror phases we're going through now. Not only does it echo the kind of sensations that liminal space imagery conjures, but it also feels like a heavy precursor to both the analog horror and creepypasta movements. Though definitely not its intention, because at the time it was dealing with what were current devices, all of its horror now revolves around unsettling discoveries involving old technology, but in a way that feels very in line with how modern audiences and creators develop stories, mythology, and visuals around the use of these things. I mean, the discovery of a creepy old website full of people doing bizarre things in dark rooms, is that not just the famous creepypasta story Normal Porn for Normal People? The feeling of surveillance that permeates the film in scenes where characters will watch strangers through monitors, not even fully knowing who they are or what they are doing, but just having this unusual and unnatural access to them. That feels very much like the vibes of Alan Resnick's This House Has People in It. When the main group discover hidden faces in the darkness of monitors, doesn't that feel eerily similar to the analog horror of something like the game Fear Assessment? The scares feel very in line with a lot of the media we consume today, dealing with the horror of things like technical glitches, using the fallibility of technology as a basis for scares, which is something that's only really just starting to crop up as a repeated horror motif now. There's a moment where a news anchor on television starts to glitch out in impossible ways that feels wildly ahead of its times in terms of the kind of methods it's utilising to craft tension. And why is that? Is it because Cairo is just a very forward-thinking and influential horror movie? Maybe. It certainly has some imaginative sequences that have been replicated and celebrated in other movies since then, such as this moment with a light that feels a lot like something from David F. Sandberg's Lights Out. But I actually think, while that's a partial factor, a far bigger reason it feels so relevant today, and as to why its style seems to be replicated more now than the 20 plus years ago when it released, is because the kind of things it's dealing with have only become more relevant. It makes sense that the fallibility of technology would become more of a source of horror when it's a way bigger cause for cultural anxiety than it was back then. What with the growing issues of things like online stalking and harassment, misinformation campaigns and deepfakes, radicalization, just to name a few. We may now know a lot more about the internet and technology and how to use it, but our reasons to be cautious of it are greater than ever before. I don't want to sound like an old whinge here, so I will preface this by saying the internet has a lot of great uses and I personally have made genuine social connections and lifelong friends through it, but there is some merit in pointing out that it can be perceived that growing disconnect is occurring between people and being cultivated from a technology that should theoretically allow us all to form better connections with one another. Algorithms push negativity, platforms like Twitter definitely benefit from and manifest further divisiveness and tribalism. And this is all the stuff Cairo was trying to explore. The disenfranchisement, the loneliness, the isolation. It basically eerily predicted internet radicalization. The internet ghosts in this thing claim victims by basically having their utter isolation and sadness and despair be contagious, until the user who comes into contact with the ghost picks up their emotions and adopts them themselves. Is that really all that different from, say, I don't know, incel culture? Finding websites on corners of the internet where nothing good happens, and being drawn into the negative and toxic ideas that reside there to an unhealthy and dangerous extent, until you become just another one of the ghosts that lurk its pages, spreading more despair into the world with those same adopted emotions, creating a never-ending cycle? I don't think so. I think it's borderline eerie how much the sentiments of this 2001 movie feel so parallel with these issues around technology and its communities we face today. The film also captures that perpetual vibe of ennui it sometimes feels like we culturally reside in, often from the misuse of these technologies and the enhancement of the toxic voices and ideals that came with that. After Taguchi dies, his co-workers sit in a cafe and discuss why he would have killed himself, and one of them casually utters, "Maybe he just wanted to die." I get like that too sometimes. A phrase that is met with no pushback, as if normal, perhaps even agreeable, and like, dude, do you want to hug, mate? The character who utters this, of course, also becomes next to fall to the ghosts, almost as if his listless disenfranchisement makes him an easy target to fall victim to their harmful and emotionally crippling ideas. I mean, a young, seemingly depressed man being taken in by internet ghouls bad for his mental health and pushing him into further despair to the point of endangerment? Yeah, that doesn't sound relevant to today's world at all. And of course, it helps as well that the film is just exceptionally executed throughout, to the point that if this thematic richness or relevance to today wasn't there, it would still have some incredibly atmospheric, dread-filled, and scary-ass ghostly encounters. Some people believe it has one of the scariest scenes ever crafted in cinema. And yeah, for those of you that have seen it, I'm obviously not going to finish the video without talking about that scene. I am going to finish here after I speak about it, but this is a part that you maybe don't want spoiled. So in case you have to drop off now, let me just remind you all, this month of videos is in aid of Trans Lifeline. So please be sure to donate to Trans Lifeline at any of the donation links on this page if you're able. And also, if you buy a shirt at the link in the description, 100% of profits on those will be going to the charity too, on top of ad revenue and Patreon money for this month. And if you've already seen the film, or aren't bothered about spoilers, or want to know what you're getting into, stick around because I'm going to talk about that scene right now. So early in the film, our seemingly depressed fella we've just been mentioning is investigating the strange circumstances of Taguchi's death, and it takes him to this room with a red tape door. As he descends the stairs, it's this kind of thick concrete and dark angular room. Just this very kind of cold, unpleasant bunker of a building, totally devoid of anything but the hard flat grey of its floors and walls. He observes a strange pattern on the wall as eerie music builds, and upon turning around, there's something there. A woman? Maybe? It's hard to tell. She's in the dark and blends almost seamlessly in the background. Were it not for the triangular shape in the concrete framing her perfectly, you might not notice her at all. And even with it, she's barely visible. And then, she starts to walk. But walking would be an inaccurate way to describe it. She is literally walking, she's taking steps towards him, but it's unnatural and weird and indescribably wrong. Because it's almost human, but it's not quite there. It occupies that uncanny valley. And then, on the third step, there's this eerily slow wobble and near fall. One that brings her face into the light in what feels like a reveal, but she just looks like a person, which somehow only makes it scarier. If she looked monstrous or otherworldly, it might explain away her strange movement. But seeing this expressionless but otherwise normal face just adds to that uncanny, almost human but not quite vibe. It's a scene that goes on again to demonstrate the different approach to horror and tension found a lot in this J-horror period. Everything is slow, deliberate, and as the scene resolves, there's this horrible moment of helplessness where Yabe, our character being pursued, is hidden behind a sofa, unable to see where the ghost has gone, as her hands just slowly crawl over the top, followed by an unblinking stare. We do not see what happens to Yabe, we're just left to imagine it. Our sole information as to what possibly occurred being the build-up we saw and the terrified wreck he turns into when we next see him. I know I already did this with The Ring, but comparing this scene to its counterpart in its American remake demonstrates even more substantially the different approaches that different filmmakers and cultures had to these visuals and subject matter. And this one is night and day, because, my god, I like to try and find positive things to say, but the American version of this scene just absolutely butchers Kurosawa's original vision. It doesn't use the lighting to its fullest at all. The face isn't revealed with the stumble, it's just this ghastly piercing white straight away. They totally get rid of any of the uncanny, almost human quality by having her just cheesily swoosh teleport about the place on the moment of the stumble. It's intercut with close-ups and closes out on a flashy and ineffective ending jump scare. And we even see what she does to the guy, but it's just this lame effect where she's like, I don't know, inhaling his soul or something. It doesn't trust its audience to have any patience and totally undoes everything that makes the original scene so special in favour of a faster, flashier, but far less interesting scene. Just an absolutely disastrous effort in adaptation, but one that fully demonstrates just how impressively crafted Kurosawa's original work was. And it's that impressive craft paired with the profound and intelligently dissected themes that are still relevant to this day that make this film absolutely worthwhile, even when you take into account the manic, confusing nature of its plot that borders on falling apart. I personally consider it a flawed masterpiece. It's not a perfect movie, its last hour has some sections that are just a confusing slog, but man, is it filled to the brim with some perfect moments. And that, my friends, is another episode in this celebration of horror under wraps. I've already covered the charity stuff earlier, so I'd just like to take this opportunity to instead remind you of the unrelated efforts that are also going on this month. Firstly, I'm now a creative advisor on the next entry in the massive In Search of Darkness horror documentary franchise, and as such, I have a 10% discount code for anyone who wants to pick up their first foray into the 90s decade. Discount code and link in the description. I really recommend you check that out. These documentaries are some of the most seminal retrospectives on the horror world, and I genuinely can't wait for this one. And I'd be saying that even if I wasn't involved in it. Secondly, if I'm still in the running, please remember to vote for me to be this year's Face of Horror. You get a free vote every 24 hours, and you can purchase more votes if you wish, and should you do so, you'll be supporting the B Plus Foundation, which is a charity helping fight childhood cancer. Other than that, you know the drill. I've been Dan Drambles. Remember to like, comment and subscribe to my Only Dans at the red button below. Hit that bell, and I'll see you all again tomorrow.